All right, everybody, welcome back to Arena in the Boardroom. It is such a pleasure to have you on board today. I'm Benjamin Parker, and I'm privileged as always to have you with us on this platform. I have several other platforms. I'll even mention one of those at the end of this particular podcast. But we're talking tonight about the Raiders, and one of my favorite subjects in all of NFL really is looking at bad teams and figuring out how to fix them. And at a glance, that looks easy, but even if not easy, it certainly looks fun. And listen, I know it's not as easy as it appears because in some instances you have some very deep-rooted organizational problems and, owners that won't let you do what you need to do as a GM or a coach. But all that being said, from a distance, it's a lot of fun to take a look at some of these teams who are on the bottom or who have been on the bottom for a very long time and try to take those rosters and those organizations and make recommendations about how to improve them. And listen, not all ideas are good and not all good ideas work. You constantly have to be willing to adjust and refocus and everything look like that. And sometimes you have an idea that looked pretty good and it just didn't work and you kick it out. So, all of my recommendations tonight, as always, they are subject for review by all of you listening, by myself as always, and by anybody else who may or may not have any interest in them. So focus tonight is on the Raiders. And as most of you already know, they just recently let go of their head coach and general manager, McDaniels and Ziegler, after about a year and a half. Not really a super big surprise on the head coaching side that they would let McDaniels go. To me, I think a bit of a surprise that they would also kick Ziegler out the door. General managers tend to get longer. We've seen in the NFL kind of a pattern of general managers not getting as long as they used to, but even so, year and a half, I think it was for Ziegler, something like that. Still pretty quick, so I was a little surprised at that. But having said that, the deed is done, and that water's under the bridge now. So the Raiders now have a chance to move forward. And I've got a quick outline here, maybe 6, 7, maybe 8 things here that I would love to see the Raiders do going forward. And it's not super deep. It's not super in depth. It's just a generic outline of stuff that I would love to see the Raiders do over the next off season, but really over the next 3 or 4 years is really where I think this can extend to. So we're going to jump right in. Here's the first thing that I would love to see the Las Vegas Raiders do. Number one, right off the bat, evaluate your organization. And that starts with Mark Davis. Mark Davis is the guy who has to do this as the owner. Listen, he took over when his dad passed, I think 12, 13 years ago, something like that, or whenever his dad gave him the team. I forget exactly how that transacted, but in any case, I believe when his dad, Al Davis, passed, Mark Davis got the team. And ever since then, there's been a lot of dysfunction. And to be honest, even as you look through the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, even when his dad was still the owner, there was a lot of dysfunction that went through that as well. Once the early 80s had kind of passed and Tom Flores had kind of moved on, you got a little bit of stability there with Art Shell, I think in the late 80s, early 90s. And then that's been it. Ever since then, it's kind of been chaos and weird things and just kind of the Raiders creating this reputation, not only of being aggressive and kind of outside the mainstream, but of not being very good. And that's the problem. Being aggressive and not being mainstream is fine. Kind of having that pirate rogue outlook on life is fine. But the problem is they haven't been good. And in fact, they've been overused term, but dysfunctional is really what they've been. And specifically since Mark Davis took over, when you look at the coaches and the general managers that have come through and the turnover, and then you look at the win-loss records by season and the playoff appearances or lack thereof, it's just been a lot, man. And the Raiders need to evaluate. So part of that is, and I think this has been well covered in the media, is Mark Davis looking at himself and his own decision-making and deciding, where do I need to make adjustments? Do I need to step back and let other people handle this more? That's where it starts. But I'm going to take it a step further than that, and that is this, that Mark Davis needs to look around the organization and see who, if anyone, It's given him a lot of advice over the last 10, 12 years. And is that person or those people's advice not working? Is it consistently bad advice, or is it consistently good advice, quote unquote, that just isn't working out? And listen, we all know in every organization, I don't care if it's your local McDonald's or if it's your local high school, all the way up to the major corporations, there's always somebody at the top, but that somebody at the top has one, two, three people in their ear. And those one, two, or three people have a strong influence on some of the outcomes that the person at the top makes. You know, I don't care if that's the Queen of England or if it's the King of Bavaria, you know, whatever. Those people, those two or three people, they have a strong influence on the person at the top and what comes out of there. So if you're Mark Davis and if you're the Raiders, you need to take a strong look, I think, inside the organization. Who in that building over the past 10, 12, 13 years has had a strong voice that maybe should have a lesser voice? Who's getting to put a lot of opinions out there that maybe their opinions haven't been very good? Who means well but doesn't really seem to know what they're doing? Or who doesn't mean well and just seems to have other motives and other agendas besides winning football games? And so that's something that I would really encourage the Raiders to look at. And Mark Davis is the guy who's got to do that. And listen, that's not easy. You know, I don't know from experience, but I know from watching people, when you are at the top of anything, you're rich, you have a certain amount of power, whatever, it's very difficult to take an honest look at yourself. But if Mark Davis wants the Raiders to win, that's what he's going to have to do. Is take a look at himself and take a look at who he's listening to consistently over the past few years, because it hasn't been working out. Number two, this would come at some point during the off season, maybe even before, is hire a general manager. That's obvious. I'm going to list about three candidates that I like, but there's a lot of good candidates out there for general manager. It's always tough, isn't it, to know who can build a good roster. And I'm sorry for stuttering and stammering there. I'm trying to set things up here. Who can build a good roster? That's always tough to know. We see people who are in assistant general manager roles with other teams, or maybe they're in scouting roles. And it's just tough to assess how much credit they get for the draft picks or for the free agents signed or for the draft picks or free agents who weren't signed or drafted, those kinds of things. It's hard enough to take a look at a head coach from a previous spot or even an assistant coach at a previous spot and try to evaluate how they're going to be a head coach at your place. Way more difficult. But here are three quick names that I like for general manager here for the Raiders. Number one is Adam Peters. He's the assistant general manager with the 49ers, has worked with them for a few years now. Seems to have an excellent reputation, really seems to be at the top of a lot of wish lists for general managers around the league. That's somebody, if I were the Raiders, I would really want to make a run at. He seems to have had a pretty good influence there with the 49ers. And again, it's hard to pick that out. But Adam Peters seems to be a guy with good reputation that I would like the Raiders to really get aggressive about. If not Peters, because I think he's probably at the top of a lot of people's wish lists, I would be looking at Ian Cunningham, the Bears assistant general manager. And listen, I understand the Bears haven't done well the past few years. On the field, off the field, it hasn't been good. But you look at Ian Cunningham, he's got the connection to Ozzie Newsome, spent some time with Ozzie Newsome, who was one of the best general managers we've ever seen with the Ravens a few years ago. And then also he spent significant time with the Eagles and their organization as they kind of were in their Super Bowl ramp-ups between one Super Bowl and heading to the next. And then you look there, it feels like, I haven't addressed every move, but it feels like since he got the Bears, some of the moves have started to take on a better direction. And you could ask the question, well, how connected is he to Ryan Poles? And you know, can he separate himself from maybe the Poles influence? I think is a fair question. But in any case, I wouldn't just look at the Bears' struggles or the Bears' win-loss record and kick Ian Cunningham out the door of candidates. I like Ian Cunningham, like his background as a player. I like how quickly he segued from players straight up into front office stuff. I like Ian Cunningham as a legit guy there for the Raiders to look at for general manager. And the third guy would be Ed Dodds, the Colts assistant general manager. The best thing I like about Dodds is very, 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 very strong scouting capabilities. Really like that, and seems to come from a pretty good organization there with the Colts. One drawback with him seems to be that he's got a Jim Harbaugh connection. I personally wouldn't want Jim Harbaugh to come to the Raiders. I'll get to that in future videos, probably not tonight. But if I could convince, if it came down to me wanting to hire Ed Dodds, I would want to talk to Dodds, and I really would want him to separate himself from Jim Harbaugh. Maybe he already has, but in any case, that would be something I would look at. Now, listen, those are my three preferred candidates for the Raiders. There's a lot of appears to be quality general manager candidates out there. I'm going to list off several, and there's a bunch more. So Kat Raich, the Browns assistant general manager, she's doing a good job over there. She's legit. John Spytek with the Buccaneers, Andy Weidel, Steelers assistant general manager, Mike Borgonzi, Chiefs assistant general manager, Terrence Gray with the Bills, Jeff Ireland with the Saints, Alec Calaby with the Eagles, Champ Kelly with the Raiders, in-house hire if you want to look at that. Brandon Brown, Giants assistant general manager. There's a lot of people out there who are legit candidates, and I encourage teams to look at all of them. But ultimately, my three for the Raiders would be Peters, Cunningham, and Dodds. One thing I would encourage the Raiders to get away from is to follow into this mindset of only hiring former Patriots, front office people, or former Chiefs front office people, or former Eagles front office people. The connection doesn't always follow. Just because you were a part of a winning organization doesn't always follow. Now, it's nice to have been a part of that, but you really want to make sure that you're hiring somebody that you like what they do. That success doesn't always come over. We've seen that a lot with former Patriots front office people, in spite of the fact that the Houston Texans general manager is former Patriots. He seems to be doing a good job, but I would try to get away from just hiring somebody from the Eagles or the Chiefs and letting that be the end of it. I would really want them to sit down and look at these candidates. So that's what I would do right there at general manager, at least on the outset. Number three, I would hire a coach, and I would try to make sure that I just get a stable person, a stable guy who's going to stay for 5 years. And that sounds so obvious, right? It sounds so ridiculously obvious. But the Raiders have been a revolving door of coaches, not just the past 2 or 3 years, but for many years. I think you have to go all the way back to Art Shell in the 90s to find the last Raiders coach who actually coached for 5 seasons. And that's just ridiculous, to be honest. That is ridiculous. I understand that sometimes when things aren't working out, you have to make a decision to move on quick. And I'm glad that the Raiders did that with McDaniels. But it's a real problem that this has been going on for 30 freaking years if you're the Raiders. That is just almost the definition of dysfunction, to be quite honest about it. So I'll state the obvious. The Raiders need to make a hire. It may not be a big splashy hire, and it may not even necessarily be a Super Bowl winning hire, although the name I'm about to suggest I think could be. But you need to hire somebody, let them settle in and do a job for 5 years and bring some stability back to this organization that you haven't seen for quite a while, and then reevaluate after that. And listen, I know that's always the intent. Nobody hires anybody with the intent of axing them after a season and a half or 2 seasons or 3 seasons. That's not the intent. I get it. But it would steer me away from certain head coaching hires, such as the Jim Harbaugh. I would want to get a person in there that I know I could keep for 5 years and maybe for 10, 15 years. That's really what I'm looking at. So that's going to trim out a couple of head coaching candidates for me. So the guy I would be after immediately is Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson is the offensive coordinator for the Lions. The work that he has done there in Detroit, I think, has been exceptional. Now, there's no way to know if he'll be a good head coach or not. You never, ever know. I don't care how good of an assistant, DC or OC they are. I don't care. There's no guarantee that he'll be a good head coach. But I like the work that he's done there with the offense, and I think bringing him to the Raiders would immediately improve the offense across the board. And then you just make him hire a defensive coordinator that seems to be really one of the more well-reputable defensive coordinators available. So that's who I would be going after, Ben Johnson. Asterisk to that, if you want to give Antonio Pierce a chance at this, that's fine, but just realize that Ben Johnson probably won't be available in a year or two. He'll be gone, and you'll be having to look at somebody else. So if they really want to give Antonio Pierce a chance at this, which I encourage, by the way. Antonio Pierce is the linebackers coach that was moved up to interim head coach here for the Raiders. I would encourage them to give him a chance. But if I were going to do that, I wouldn't make that cloudy. I would give him a very real goal that he has to reach. Basically, I think what I would do, I would say make the playoffs. That's going to be a little bit tough there in the AFC because even at 4-5, the Raiders are about, I don't know, 10th or 11th in line for a playoff spot. So that might be asking a bit much. But you might want to set the goal of, hey, have a winning record from here on out for the rest of the season. He's 1-0. If you can keep a winning record, not a 500 record, a losing record, a winning record for the rest of the season, then here's your 3-year contract, and we'll evaluate year by year. It can't be a feel-good story. We see so many interim guys who not only aren't getting any real chance to be the head coach the next year. We saw that with Rich Bisaccia. I think it was definitely Bisaccia for the Raiders a couple of seasons ago. We see so many interim head coaches who really aren't being given a chance, even if they're being told that they are. And in some kind of a nebulous, cloudy way, the organization just kind of decides to evaluate all its options and go in some other direction, right? If you really want to give Antonio Pierce a chance, tell him that you're going to do that. Tell him something to the effect of, you've got to have a winning record for the rest of the season, and then here's your 3-year contract. But if you don't want to do that, if you've already decided you don't want to give Pierce a chance, then tell him. Okay? Just tell him, hey, you're interviewing for a spot somewhere else. We're not going to hire you. But don't leave it nebulous. I really hate it when franchises do that. I think I understand why they do that. But I would be very clear about that. And listen, you don't want the warm and fuzzy story to affect it. If you're going to do that, then just go ahead and tell Antonio Pierce, hey, if everybody likes you at the end of the year, we'll just go ahead and give you a 1-year contract for next year and see how you do. If you're going to go the warm and fuzzy route. So love Antonio Pierce, did a great job there in the first game against the Giants, but that's how I would handle the coaching search. Number 4, I think it is, we're on. And this is an important one, might be the most important one of all, and might be the one in which the most people disagree with me, but that's okay. Everybody sees things a different way. Number 4 for me is I would keep the major players there on the Raiders. And specifically, I'm talking about wide receiver Davante Adams, defensive end Max Crosby, and left tackle Colton Miller. And here's the thinking for me. These players, all 3 of them are relatively young, Adams, Crosby, and Miller. They're not they're 29 or younger. I can't say Davante Adams is young, but they're relatively either at their peak or younger. I think Crosby and Miller are still at their peak or younger. And not only that, they're all 3 signed for the next 2 to 3 seasons, depending on which player you're looking at. And all 3 of them have relatively decent cap numbers. They're not brutal cap numbers for their positions and for how good they are. And then even further, you're going to have somebody at quarterback next year, this year for sure, but for the next couple of seasons, whether it's Garoppolo or whether it's Aiden O'Connell or whether it's another young quarterback that you bring in, that young quarterback or whoever it is, even if it's Garoppolo, that young quarterback is going to need people to play with. He's going to need a good offensive line. He's going to need somebody to throw the football to. So there's really no reason to be trading away these players. Now, the common thinking is, oh, this organization's so bad, they just need to tear it down to the studs and start over. But that's not productive. What that does is that introduces you to being even worse than you've been for the next 2 to 3 seasons while you bring in all these draft picks, which I love draft picks, by the way. And you could get some decent draft picks for Adams, Crosby, and Miller. What you're really doing is falling farther behind. Okay. So what the Raiders need to do, because they've got the cap space to afford these 3 people. Listen, it's different for teams that are tight on cap space or they're already winning and they need to flip a guy who they know they're not going to keep the following off season or whose cap number is about to get instrumentally larger. That's not the case for these 3 players. They're all under cap for the next 2 to 3 seasons. They're all either at their peak or they're younger guys. And they're important. They are important players. And no matter who you've got playing quarterback next year, you're going to need these people to kind of bolster him. You're going to be looking for people to support that quarterback no matter who it is, whether it's Garoppolo or somebody else. So I think it's very important to keep these 3 people. It also encourages the franchise. And maybe most of all, it gives the fans hope that, hey, this team can still be decent. And I know there's a term floating around out there called a competitive rebuild or something like that. I'm not even trying to do that. It just doesn't make sense to let these players go. It's always something different. If you've got a guy who's fixing to be a free agent the next offseason and you can flip him for draft picks because you know that the draft picks are going to be better and you already have a decent team and you're looking to add draft picks to that team, that's not the case here. So I do think that's a really important point for the Raiders. Keep Adams, keep Crosby, keep Miller. I don't know if they'll do that or not. Probably not, but that's what I would be doing for sure. Number 5, improve the offensive line. The offensive line hasn't been as bad this year as I thought it would be, but it's still not good enough. And the Raiders haven't necessarily ignored it over the years. They've invested some draft picks, obviously with Colton Miller and then Brandon Parker, which didn't work, and Dylan Parham over the last season or two with Memphis. So it's not that they've necessarily been ignoring it, but they need to upgrade it. They need a better offensive line. It just hasn't been good for a while now, for several seasons. So they need to keep focusing on getting this offensive line better so they can run the ball, so they can run the play action, so they can give the quarterback at least 3 seconds to throw the dadgum football. They need to keep working on that. And that doesn't necessarily mean throwing money or draft picks at it. Excuse me, I'm talking so much, my mouth is getting dry here. What that does mean is intelligently looking at the offensive line and deciding we are going to improve this, or we're going to make an effort to improve it. So you take a high-end draft pick and you put it in there in the offensive line. And that can be at right tackle, or that can be at center, or that can be at guard. And then you add in maybe another free agent to that offensive line. Again, it doesn't have to be somebody spectacularly expensive, but find somebody who just plays a good, solid offensive line, add them to what you already have, and continue to try to improve that offensive line. You can't keep letting that hinder the offense and get your quarterback sacked, as we've seen several times over the past few seasons. So I think that's important as well. Number 6, draft a mobile quarterback with a strong arm. This isn't just to be trendy. I know everybody wants a mobile quarterback with a big arm, but one reason I think the Raiders need it is because you want to keep Davante Adams happy. Now, listen, Aiden O'Connell is going to get a chance, and rightfully so, to win this quarterback job. And even coming through the draft process, I thought he was good enough at Purdue to keep an NFL team competitive. But he doesn't have a strong arm. And I think unless you start moving Davante Adams, I don't think it's any different than having Jimmy Garoppolo there at quarterback for the Raiders. Unless you start moving Davante Adams into the slot a lot, then I think Adams is going to be still rather unhappy with O'Connell's ability to get the ball out to him in the deep spaces where he can really show off what he can do. So if I'm the Raiders, and listen, you might be stuck with Garoppolo at quarterback for another year, because give me 1 second, I'm going to look up the dollars on this, on the Jimmy Garoppolo for 2024. I'm pulling this off of Spot Tracks, excellent website. $28.5 million cap hit next year. The dead cap is 28.3. So you don't save anything really by trading him or releasing him. But if you can trade him and get something for him, great. I'm not sure they can. They may be stuck with him for one more season. We'll see how that works out. There's a lot of different ways you could do that, but it's going to be expensive from a cap space. They may just decide to move on anyway. But anyway, whether you've got Garoppolo there or not, Aiden O'Connell there or not, I would still make a point to bring in a mobile quarterback with a strong arm, not an average arm, not an accurate arm. Mobile quarterback with a strong arm. And the point of that is you want a quarterback who can compete with Garoppolo and O'Connell and offer something different. But the larger point is you want to keep Davante Adams happy. And bringing in a quarterback with a strong arm who can get the ball downfield to Adams, even if he's just throwing 50-50 balls to Adams, is going to go a long ways, I think, toward keeping Davante Adams happy. Going to go a long ways toward keeping everybody happy. Now, there's some quarterbacks in this year's draft who give you that chance. Caleb Williams is at the top of that. The Raiders would have to trade a lot to move up to pick up Caleb Williams out of USC. Don't know if they're going to be able to do that or not, but he's at the top of the list. Another quarterback there is Michael Penix Jr., Washington. Doesn't have quite as strong of an arm as Caleb Williams, but still fully capable of getting the ball downfield with accuracy. He's a left-hander and mobile as well. Even if you go deeper in the draft, though, there are guys like Michael Pratt from Tulane who have strong arms and they're mobile. And there's several quarterbacks in this year's draft who kind of fit that. So even if you don't want to necessarily throw another first-round pick at a quarterback or throw a first-round pick at a quarterback, You've got options, but I would encourage that. And again, I've listed the reasons for that. All right, so number 7, I would use number 7. I would draft more receiving options and types. So you got Hunter Renfrow, you got Jacoby Meyer, you've got Michael Meyer, and you've got Devontae Adams. But I would continue looking at gadget people. You can pick up Jacob Cowan, I think, from Arizona, somewhere there in the 5th, 6th, 7th round. He's kind of a gadget guy. I would be looking to add in maybe another big receiver for the Raiders. Johnny Wilson out of Florida State comes to mind. There are even more talented receivers that you can get in the first round, such as a Keon Coleman out of Florida State that you can get. There's Rome Odunze from Washington. I would continue looking at upgrading the wide receiver position, even though it's not terrible, but I would also look at bringing in different types, such as gadget guys. And the thinking is here, and this is really where I'm going with this, if you hire a guy like Ben Johnson, you're able to pull him over from Detroit. Ben Johnson can do a lot. I still don't think he has all the weapons he could utilize there in Detroit. If you have him there with the Raiders, he could utilize all of these receiver options and get very creative. We've already seen it. Plus, he's fundamental with running the football. We've seen that he likes to do that as well. So I would be wanting to give Ben Johnson as many different types of receivers and good receivers as possible if, in fact, they are able to pull Ben Johnson over. Last, certainly not least, though, this is number 8. I would use the extra cap space for defense. So I mentioned that the Raiders aren't cash strapped, even though they've got several players who are high dollar players. They've got some maneuverability last I checked. But anyway, whatever cap space that you've got, and this doesn't mean you stop drafting on defense, but listen, I've already encouraged them to draft the offensive line and draft wide receiver and draft quarterback. So you can see where I'm going in next year's draft. It's pretty obvious. But I would take the cap space and I would use that on defense. And some of those players that I would be on the lookout for, don't know if they'll be available or not, would be Antoine Winfield, safety from the Buccaneers, Brian Burns, edge from the Panthers, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, safety for the Eagles, and Christian Wilkins, defensive tackle for the Dolphins. These 4 players are all proven players. They didn't just have a big one-year splash. They are proven at what they do. They are all, I think, 27 years old or younger, all 4 of them. And they would all have, pretty heavy cap space numbers, but it wouldn't be just brutal cap space numbers. The Raiders could afford at least one of these guys. Winfield from the Buccaneers would be my preferred option. Again, these players may not be available at all in free agency next year, but that's what I would be looking at if I were the Raiders. All right, so I'm going to be doing a lot more detailed videos, I think, on this over on YouTube. You can find me at, I think, Sports and Money. I'm also, I think, under Pro Football GM at YouTube. And I apologize, sometimes those videos are hard to find over there, but I will be doing several more of these in more detail. If you want to slide over and take a look at that, I would appreciate it. That is the plan anyway. Thank you so much for listening. This is Arena in the Boardroom. I am Ben Parker. Have a great night. Goodbye.